Welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. Today, my guest is the evolutionary biologist and journalist, Colin Wright. He's also the founder of a Substack called Reality's Last Stand, where he continually makes the case for the differentiation between sex and gender. We had a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Colin, thanks very much for joining me.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. I'm a big admirer of your work.
Really appreciate that. Well, let's crack straight on with it. I mean, I've never had an evolutionary biologist on the show before, so you'll be in a position to be able to tell me, is sex a spectrum?
So it is not a spectrum. There tends to be a lot of ways people try to argue that it is, but it's really confused about what sex actually is, which is, how your reproductive anatomy is organized around, the type of gamete it's organized around to produce. So people will use things like the existence of intersex people, so people who have ambiguous genitalia, as this way to suggest that males and females are just these arbitrary social constructs. Or they'll confuse the secondary sex characteristics facial hair and sort of the upper body strength that men get or breast development as evidence that sex is a spectrum, because these individual traits might differ and overlap between males and females. But this is just fundamentally misunderstands what it means for someone to be a male or female. So sex isn't a spectrum any more than, flipping a coin could potentially land on its edge 1 out of every 6,000 flips. Doesn't mean that heads and tails don't exist. So that's sort of my take on that.
So when, you would be able to find women that are a lot stronger than me, that are a lot more traditionally masculine than me, but that doesn't mean that there's a third sex.
No, not at all. I mean, there would have to be another type of reproductive anatomy that is evolved, that someone can exhibit, that's organized around to produce a third type of gamete, something between sperm or ova. So a lot of people think when I say that there's two sexes, that I mean that every single individual on the entire planet can be, categorically defined as either male or female. Now, I kind of leave it open. Someone might be able to be, have a developmental condition that makes them truly sexually ambiguous in certain ways, but they wouldn't be a third sex in the same way that male and female are individual sexes.
So why do I hear all the time intersex people being used as examples of a third sex, much to the annoyance of a lot of intersex people, I notice?
Yeah, it's part of a larger move to try to blur the lines between male and female and to assert that male and female are these social constructs, which is then being used by trans activists to suggest that people who are unambiguously male or female should therefore be able to identify as the opposite sex, and then no one can tell them that they're wrong. So in a way, these intersex individuals are just being used by activists to further their own agenda, because even if sex were a spectrum, it still doesn't indicate that you can choose where along that spectrum you reside. So their arguments just sort of don't hold up, no matter even if you grant them what they would like you to grant.
So perhaps you could talk us through then this differentiation between sex and gender, because I think that's at the heart of so much of the confusion around this debate.
Yeah, it's what kind of got me into this whole debate too, because you probably are aware that maybe in the 2010s, this is when I first started hearing about people talking about these differences between sex and gender. They were saying that sex is, your biology, it's your reproductive anatomy, but gender is how you identify. And that was something I was willing to go along with. A lot of other people were. As a biologist, I just wanted to make sure there was this sharp line between biology and, psychology to some degree. But then that line has been more and more blurred. So I know what biological sex is, which refers to, your reproductive anatomy, your primary reproductive anatomy. But gender can mean all sorts of things. And I think it's a major point of confusion in this entire, cultural discussion about it. Because some people view gender as, the equivalent of sex. They don't distinguish the two. Some think gender is just the, evolved natural differences between males and females. Some include the social aspects that maybe we've become socialized into behaving certain ways. Some people view gender as the societal norms and expectations that are placed on individuals because of the way that the sex they're perceived to be. And then some people just think that gender is just something you can completely identify with. It's like this internal sense of being male or female. So if we're going to have a debate on these, it needs to be clear about what we're talking about. I don't really have a personal definition of what gender is. I just sort of ask people what they mean and then see what whether or not that conflicts with my understanding of biology, to make sure they're not sort of trying to blur some boundaries and use sort of sophistry to confuse people or to push their agenda.
But it is very confusing. I mean, I often hear people talking about how we have an innate gender which is fixed, that we can't change, that should supersede our biological anatomy. And at the same time, I'm told that gender is really fluid and it can continually be in flux. And then I see people, for instance, there was a BBC programme where a woman was telling children as young as 5, there are over 100 different genders. And she seems so certain about this. But no one's really certain, are they?
No, and I'm not even sure what they mean by gender in these situations. I mean, it sometimes appears that they're just referring to, the recognition that people have about their sort of where they reside on the spectrum of masculinity or femininity. Like they've come to realize, if you're a girl, that you're more masculine and you have more in common with boys in terms of your likes and dislikes and personality and temperament. But yeah, then there's this whole ideological sort of overlay on everything that's is sort of almost like an immaterial soul, the way they talk about gender identity. We all have one. This is this deep-seated thing, and we know from a very young age, even though it can change from moment to moment. And then we should use this as a basis for springing forth and doing things like surgeries and blocking puberty, because kids know who they are, is what they say. It's one thing to say that kids are aware of their sex and are aware of their where they reside in terms of masculinity and femininity compared to their peers. It's one other thing to say that, we have this internal sense of knowing if you're a boy or a girl. Like, this is kind of a sort of a religious framework that they're dealing with. It exits the realm of science and is really entering sort of pseudoscience mysticism type of thing, in my view.
And given that these definitions of this innate sexed soul being either male or female invariably draw us back to quite conservative ideas of what it means to be male and female. They tend to rely on sex stereotypes. If we're teaching children this, is that not quite a regressive step?
Yeah, I mean, this is the angle I try to convince people of the harms of gender ideology. The feminist movement is in large part defined by this, trying to defy gender norms, saying that just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't be masculine. I can't be an engineer or a scientist. I can't, be risk-taking. I can't be aggressive. All these things that they were trying to shake off. And what gender ideology has really done, it's sort of embraced those ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman in a very essentialist sense. And it asserts that, if you're behaving feminine, then and you're a boy, then maybe you're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body. There was a really good summation of this. It talked about, sort of feminism was that, boys and girls, men and women can both do the dishes. And then it said equality was this idea that, that both men and women, it started off saying sexism was that women should do the dishes. And then it was equality, both men and women should do the dishes. And then gender ideology really says that whoever's doing the dishes is a woman. Like, that's sort of how they're framing things now, based on, identifying with these roles.
So then that leads us into this realm of non-binary. And I keep seeing this phrase online, non-binary lives are valid. But as far as I can see, someone who identifies as non-binary is just someone who doesn't see themselves as fitting into traditional roles of male or female. And therefore, by identifying as non-binary, they are, in a sense, reinforcing those roles.
Exactly. The non-binary phenomenon, I think, is really shows what's behind the mask of a lot of the gender ideology stuff, because they're not claiming that they're intersex. It's not like they're claiming to be somewhere in between male and female. Although some will use male and female as identities, but what they're really saying is the so-called gender binary that a non-binary person is objecting to isn't the biological categories of male and female. It's like the social roles and expectations that are associated with being male and female. So, these types of roles about masculinity and femininity and what those roles mean for society. So they're basically just saying that, they don't agree, they don't identify with these maximally masculine roles or these maximally feminine roles. They're somewhere in between. And we used to just call that gender
non-conformity. Saying that for years, haven't they?
Yeah, I attended a gender webinar recently that I sort of infiltrated, and under this, they had this big umbrella that was like non-binary, and underneath it, and keep in mind, non-binary is considered a subset of transgenderism, but under the non-binary umbrella was literally just gender non-conformity. So, gender non-conforming kids, adults, they're now considered transgender according to this new ideology.
But they're absolutely not. I mean, I was a gender non-conforming child. I didn't play football. I didn't. I preferred hanging out with girls and boys. It's absolutely not the case that makes you trans.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really big definitional shift that I think a lot of people have not really caught up to. I mean, I'm the same way. I'm a straight man, but I'm certainly not, like a Randy Macho Man Savage type of masculine character. I think a day spent bottle feeding kittens sounds like a nice a nice day for me. But so by their definitions, I would be considered non-binary or gender fluid or something like that. And this is something we need to really push back on. It's one thing to just sort of imagine what it means to be trans in these cases. What's the harm if kids just identify this way? Well, there is a whole medical apparatus that is set up around people who are identifying as trans and what it means to be gender dysphoric. And so if we're letting gender nonconforming kids be trans, or if we're defining them as being trans literally, this opens the door to a medicalization. It medicalizes gender nonconformity. And the medical institutions really need to catch up to this change in definition, because I believe it's causing a lot of harm, and it's contributing to this insane medical scandal that's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I have no objection to people. If someone wants to identify as non-binary, that's fine. I mean, they can. People identify as punks or as goths or whatever. These fashions come and go. I don't have a problem with it at all. But the idea that is often interpreted as being a repudiation of the biological reality of sexual dimorphism, that to me is a problem then.
Yeah, they flip-flop based on, whatever furthers their ideology. So I've heard non-binary people say they just don't identify as male or female. Well, I don't know what it means to not identify as the sex that you objectively are. And then they'll sometimes, they object to this binary of man and woman as these social roles and expectations. It really makes no sense no matter which way you parse it. And it is really like the medicalization of gender nonconforming kids.
So this is where we get into dangerous territory, I think, because like I say, self-identification, people identifying, calling themselves what they want, dressing how they want, living how they want. I mean, I'm a liberal. I think anyone should be able to do that. I draw the line when people force others to use language that they don't want to do. In other words, people who would like others to use pronouns based on self-identification rather than observable biological reality. And that's an imposition too far, I would say. But there's something going on here where the discourse has moved beyond gender fluidity and self-identification and into the outright denial of biological fact.
Yeah, this is what got me out of the lab, I guess, and starting writing op-eds about this stuff. Because as I mentioned earlier, it was before we were all just asked to sort of have this compromise and use the words man and woman to refer to identity, and male and female were kept to refer to these other things. But there was an article in Nature that I think was called Sex Redefined. Biologists now think sex is more of a spectrum than just male or female. And then we had Scientific American write an article about the sex spectrum, and they've written a lot more sense. This really just drove me nuts as a biologist, to hear people say that sex is a spectrum or even just a social construct, and that males and females are just these arbitrary categories. It's complete pseudoscience any way you look at it. I used to be someone who wrote extensively about sort of the evolution versus creationism intelligent design debate. And I was protected doing this because I was in the academy and all my colleagues were evolutionary biologists. So they were fine with me debunking these ideas. But then all of a sudden, these crazy pseudosciences coming in from within the academy, I started speaking out against these things. And all of a sudden, I'm just this horrible human being. Despite the fact I'm just making biological arguments, this was beyond the pale, and this has led to a large cancellation attempt. It's bizarre.
Can I ask you about that? So, is it possible for an evolutionary biologist who is to be taken seriously to deny or to claim that sex is a spectrum? Is that actually a thing? Because one of the reasons why this is a problem for so many people is they see reputable medical journals denying science.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't view any biologist, evolutionary or otherwise, who's making these arguments about the sex spectrum. I don't see how they can be taken seriously. And what angers me the most is the reputational damage and how it destroys the trust in science. I wanted to be a science communicator. That's why I wanted to be a science, and I wanted to have students and teach classes. But this is sort of the low-hanging fruit of what biologists should be able to state definitively, because there's a lot more complicated issues out there, like epidemiology. We just went through a pandemic. There's climate change stuff, and the models that you're using to model these types of behavior, and of clouds and weather, or how a spreading infectious disease. These are so much more complex, and the same people who are telling us to trust the science on these issues, which I would hope we can, are also the ones that are saying that male and female aren't even real, and this is just a product of colonialism. And so if we can't get the fact that males and females are real, holy crap, how do we even get people to go along with the much more complex claims that scientists are previously trusted to do, that we entrust them to give us good information on it? It's a travesty.
But how has that happened? How can it be the case that the top medical journals, the top universities, now have people who claim to be biologists who don't understand biology? How has that happened?
It was sort of slow at first, and then a lot all at once. I had a lot of colleagues who I spoke to who are fantastic biologists, and just as this whole acceptance and inclusion stuff came up, they really just turned on a dime. I had been joking with them about this stuff and people denying biology for a while. They were totally in agreement. Then a lot of them, they got jobs at universities. Then they, professor jobs. Then 2 weeks later, pronouns went up in their bios, and then maybe 2 more weeks later, they're texting me saying they have to denounce me because we co-authored papers together, scientific papers, and they can no longer be associated with me because their scientific colleagues are policing their content. So a lot of it is just this social policing going on. But I think a lot of sort of become true believers on this nonsense. It's just sort of this queer theory that's crept out of the humanities somehow into the sciences. Most of my advisors and mentors, the older scientists, they think it's all crazy. But then you have a lot of the younger postdocs and grad students who have a lot of the older scientists afraid to push back against this stuff because they're afraid a big social media campaign will come out.
I think a lot of us are surprised, though, that it has infected the scientific branch of the academy, because, I come from an English literature background, and I knew full well, even when I was back in academia, that there were a lot of frauds there who were using a lot of jargon to disguise having very sort of meager understandings of literature. And bad ideas can easily seep into that kind of careerist, fraudulent discipline. But I didn't think it could happen in science, because the scientific method, by its nature, is continually testing itself, attempting to prove itself wrong, and therefore it is a sort of a means by which we edge nearer to what is true, and that's at the heart of it. So it didn't seem possible that this could infect it.
Yeah, I think it's a result of just the ever the increased skew that we have in political ideologies in universities. It's widely left skewed. Which shouldn't matter in principle if we're all applying the scientific method as we should. But this new focus on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, makes it almost impossible for people to just object to some of these ideas, especially if they're shrouded in sort of like a rainbow flag that's used as a Trojan horse to get these ideas in there. No one wants to be seen as like pushing back against these certain symbols that we've all associated with being on the right side of history, in a sense. Even when what they're saying is pseudoscience and extremely harmful.
Is part of the problem that most people are just basically decent people? And when we think of this debate, we think of those people with gender dysphoria who have struggled throughout their life to reconcile this sense of themselves that they have with their anatomy. And then, for whatever reason, they feel they can only be happy if they have surgery or if they present as the opposite sex. And most of us feel a great sympathy for people of that kind, and we want those people to be happy, and we want those people to have equal rights. And that maybe is why so many people are falling in line with actually this very destructive version of that world, when it's actually a separate thing altogether. Might it be something to do with that?
Yeah, I agree with you that what's happening now is a separate thing altogether than what we used to, how we used to diagnose people with gender dysphoria and what we used to call transgender. It's really expanded just to encompass gender nonconformity. And you see these definitions being used in Planned Parenthood, even the CDC. If you just go on their website and look at what it means to be transgender, it's not behaving in a way that society expects you to act based on your biological sex. It's really just expanded to literally encompass gender nonconformity. Most people I talk to when they push back, former colleagues, they'll just say something like, you just need to accept people who they are. And I'm perfectly willing to accept people for who they are. It's just that who they are isn't a medical condition if you're just gender nonconforming. Like they're just not following the full arguments that we're making about this stuff. That it's just a very sort of sedated, just broadly inclusive idea. And they just don't see the potential harms that can cause when we're medicalizing tomboys.
Do we think perhaps that the attempt to medicalize gender non-conforming children, effectively to say that a tomboy must actually be an actual boy rather than a girl who just happens to like more traditionally boyish activities, and similarly this idea that a young camp gay effeminate gay boy is just just a woman? And might it be this move into targeting children in this way that will eventually pique everyone? Because people don't want their children sort of medicalized for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, I get messages from parents every day, multiple, and they're horrified about all of what's going on to their kids. They don't want gender ideology in their schools because their kids who had no history of even gender nonconformity are realizing that they're just not the perfect caricature of masculinity or femininity, and they're coming out as non-binary. And of course, depending on their age, they want puberty blockers or they're interested in having a double mastectomy. It's completely insane. I think parents are really going to be pushing back against this. They need to, because it ruins families, it ruins children's lives, turns them into lifelong medical patients. I've been piqued several times. So I was piqued as a biologist, and then going into this more into the ideology that's sort of producing the biology denial. I mean, I get piqued every week on this stuff. So the more we get it out there to the public, the more people that will be, shocked into an awareness of what's going on. That's going to further pushing back against this stuff and making it end. But unfortunately, people think a lot more harm is going to have to come before that gets there.
Well, I mean, I saw a parent talking the other day on a TV clip about how their child came out as trans at the age of 2, and you just have to think that's not possible. Their child can have no concept of gender identity, and it's quite. And also, whenever you hear these clips, invariably it's because of the kind of toys they play with or the kind of clothes they prefer to wear. This is just very reactionary, ultra-conservative views of what it means to be a boy and a girl.
Yeah, I mean, if you affirmed my identity when I was 2, I would be a Ninja Turtle, pretty much. And so I'm in a lot of these Facebook groups, sort of undercover, where a lot of these parents go when their kids will, express sort of any sort of gender nonconformity, because they've been hearing a lot about gender ideology, and they go to these Facebook groups to get information of and support from other people about trans issues. And these groups really just indoctrinate parents. They try to just drive them to get more and more extreme into this gender insanity. And there's people going saying, "Yeah, my 2-year-old girl is likes the color blue. My 7-year-old is gender nonconforming. They like sports all of a sudden, so maybe they're I'm getting inklings that they might be a boy." It's happening everywhere. It's literally all over the place.
There's been a further issue that some whistleblowers at pediatric gender clinics have said that a lot of the transitions are being driven by homophobia, effectively, amongst the parents who would rather have a heterosexual trans child than a gay one. Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. So a big issue here is that if we're going to say that being transgender is expanded to encompass gender nonconformity, well, there's huge bodies of research that show that being gender nonconforming is widely associated with, not every single instance, but kids who will grow up to be gay or lesbian or bi or whatever, they tend to exhibit more gender nonconformity than kids who grow up to be straight. And so if this is true, then this gender ideology is going to affect more kids, boys and girls who are going to grow up to be gay than kids who are going to grow up to be straight. So it really does, I do view it as a new form of conversion therapy, whereas previously, we had tried to like make gay kids or kids who would turn to be gay, we wanted to change their minds to match their bodies. Your sexual attraction is not matching your body. You're a boy attracted to other boys. We need to change that. What the gender ideology does, it's just the opposite. It's just like we can change your body now to match your mind, and then it's basically just transing the gay away in a very literal sense. Like this is not even a stretch, I think, to make this comparison.
But you accept that there are genuinely gender dysphoric people who do need support and help in society?
Absolutely. I'm good friends with a lot of them, Buck Angel and Blair White. There's a reason that people their age aren't coming out and detransitioning in huge numbers anymore or at all. It's because there was a lot of, they would say gatekeeping, I would say safeguarding in place, where they actually had these criteria for what is the kid who's most likely to maintain this severe type of gender dysphoria into adulthood. And this was, from a very young age, being insistent, persistent, and consistent about, how uncomfortable you are with your sex. It's usually like a hatred for your own genitals. Now, I don't think they should be put on puberty blockers and things like that. I think we should wait till they're 18 to make any sort of body modifications. But I think people like that, they would benefit from transitioning when they're adults. I think transition can be the right thing for some people to do if it makes them feel better and ameliorates their distress, for sure. But a lot of kids who are just gender nonconforming, they experience maybe a form of dysphoria, but it's more of them just sort of realizing that they don't quite fit in with people of their sex. They have more in common with the opposite sex, and that can cause some sort of anxiety potentially for kids. But that's not the same thing as the gender dysphoria that kids who truly believe and have this deep inner feeling that they're in the wrong body. This is very different than being trans. It's like dysphoria with a capital D versus just like everyday dysphoria based on noticing your gender nonconformity.
Can I ask you about, you mentioned the addition of pronouns to emails and that kind of thing. And I know you and I have both written about this. And often the pushback I get is, well, it's just a way to be polite and inclusive. But there's more to it than that, isn't there?
There's a lot more to it than that. Yeah. So because when people use pronouns, it's this disconnection they have that says that you're being a boy or a girl or a man or a woman is based on your identity and not on your sex, which boils down to stereotypes as we mentioned over. So when people go and they say, my pronouns are he, him, what are yours? They're not really asking what your sex is. You might respond like I might respond, saying he, him because I'm an adult human male. But when they hear this, because they're looking through it as a gender identity lens, what they hear is that this person says their pronouns are he, him because they identify with the social roles and expectations that are associated with masculinity, and being a man. But that's not what I think at all. So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that was saying that, this is kind of a Trojan horse for gender ideology. They want to normalize everyone using these pronouns and participating in these rituals to sort of normalize this idea of pronouns are referring, whether you're a he or a she refers to your identifying with certain stereotypes. I say to reject this idea because that's not an ideology that I want to participate in. It'd be like saying, beginning a conversation saying, "Hi, I'm Colin. I'm a Virgo. What's your star sign?" You might say, "Well, I'm a, whatever yours is based on the month that you're born in." But if you're like actually participating in this type of thing, you are really operating within this larger ideology of astrology that is completely pseudoscientific. And we would see like, I don't want to participate in, all these star sign rituals because I reject this whole framework altogether. That's really what I argue to do is you need to reject this whole pronoun ritual thing because the framework it's operating and the ideology is really bogus and denies reality.
And we're getting into the realms of compelled speech. I mean, most companies that at present are suggesting that you write your pronouns in your email or you open a meeting by announcing your pronouns. But even within that, there is a kind of coercive element. You don't want to be the person in the meeting who says, "Oh, no, I don't do that." You don't want to be the one who initiates an uncomfortable, awkward debate when you just want to be getting on with your life. And And I'm sure the time is coming when people will be mandating this. And at that point, it is compelled speech, and that is a threat to liberty.
Yeah, it starts out as a way to maybe signal to your other colleagues that you're inclusive and you're a safe space or something like that. But the more that people put these pronouns in their bios, it's not really signaling that you're part of this group or that you're inclusive, but it can then be used to sort of smoke out those who aren't doing it, because once it's so prevalent, nobody can just claim ignorance of not putting their pronouns in their bios because they didn't realize pronouns were a thing. And so not having pronouns becomes they can reasonably assume that you reject their framing in this whole things, or to them they would say it's basically announcing that you're transphobic and you're unsafe for students and things like that. So that's where we're moving towards right now. And I know a lot of universities and conferences, they don't outright say that you must put pronouns, but they highly encourage it. And people will say like, oh, what are your pronouns? They'll even hand out on your name tags, it has a little thing that says your pronouns are, and you can mark it in, so you can't claim to not have noticed that was a field to enter.
So what would you advise to people in that position? They've been told to announce their pronouns at work, but they don't want to, and they feel uncomfortable with it, and they don't want to signal some kind of fealty to this ideological movement that they have no truck with. What would your advice be?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for people to, you can have them call you by your name. You can just say, I'm not comfortable revealing my pronouns. Whatever, it's going to change by situation. And, some people might not feel that they can actually stand up to the ideology at the moment, given how precarious they might be in their career at that time, or their job. I would usually say something like, I don't agree with the ideology that's producing that question. You can call me Colin. I don't feel comfortable giving my pronouns. Something like that. I mean, I think everyone needs to really think about, for them, what would they be most comfortable saying.
Well, it's difficult, though, isn't it? Because people are quite intimidated. They're quite frightened. I'm not the only one to have noticed that the most vicious bullying you see online comes from people with pronouns in their bio, generally speaking. That's just a common correlation that lots of people notice. And that does make people nervous about, no one wants to upset the bully.
Yeah, and it would be wildly awkward if you're the only one out of a group of new hires at a company to just be the one, being the stickler about pronouns. But that's sort of what they're using, that social pressure, in order to get people to normalize this gender ideology, which I think is creating so many harms in society. So if you're aware that that's what it is, that it's gender ideology, I mean, you need to kind of take a stand, I think, for reality, and you need to be bold. I mean, there's no way to do it that's not going to be free of some awkwardness and people sort of raising their eyebrows at you, unfortunately.
But let's talk about some of those consequences, because I mean, I noticed from your Twitter feed that you recently have experienced some forms of what we would call cancellation, I suppose. What has happened there to your Patreon and the like? Yeah,
so it wasn't Patreon. So I had, so mainly I'm on Substack, and that's unaffected. I make money through there for subscriptions to articles that I write and things like that. But as sort of an additional boost for income, since I'm just sort of independent journalism, I had both PayPal set up where people could just write in how much they wanted to donate to me every month, or they could do a single donation. And then I had a store on Etsy where I just sold some merchandise that had the logo for my Substack on it, for instance. So I got a message from Etsy saying that, without any warning, my account has no strikes on it whatsoever. Etsy just out of the blue emailed me saying that after this comprehensive review with great consideration, they have opted to cancel my store, to permanently ban my store for violating their rules against, I think it was glorifying and promoting violence and hatred against protected groups.
I'm assuming you don't do that, Colin, right? You don't do that, do you?
I don't. I mean, I posted all the graphics that I have on my merchandise. There's literally only 4 things. There's one thing that just says the text "Reality's Last Stand." That's the name of my Substack, and it has a male and female symbol. There's another one that's a shield logo that has the same thing: "Reality's Last Stand," male and female symbol. There's another shield logo that says "Defender of Reality" with a male and female symbol. And then there's a political cartoon that I drew that kind of went famous because Elon Musk retweeted it. And it's just like showing the political spectrum and how it's shifted beneath my feet. And there's nothing offensive on that whatsoever. It's just a political cartoon. That's it. Only those 4 things. So I tried to appeal. They came back and said that, we're rejecting your appeal. And they reiterated that it's glorifying and promoting violence and hate. That's an annoying thing to have to change stores, but I can just take my products with me and elsewhere. It's not like a huge loss. Then PayPal sent me a message saying that I can no longer do business with PayPal forever. After some sort of review, they decided that my account was too risky or something. I have no ability to appeal. When I tried to, I got a message back from PayPal saying that if I wanted any information on any user, which includes me, that I would need to have a lawyer submit a legal subpoena to find out what's up. And this is much more like there's a world of difference between canceling someone's store and canceling someone's relationship with their donors that you sort of build up and accumulate over time. I'm sure some of them will donate elsewhere, but there's going to be a major drop off because, every time you have people put in their information somewhere else, not everyone's going to do it. I'm fortunate it's happened now before it was, such a sum that I come to rely on. But it's really spooked me because I'm an independent journalist. This is what I do. There's no telling that Substack or Stripe or something isn't going to boot me off. They're very pro free speech now, but who knows how their management might change in the next 5 or 10 years. So yeah, it's a pretty scary place to be in when payment processors are the ones that are canceling business with you.
And it's quite. I mean, it's outrageous. They're accusing you effectively of hateful behavior. They're accusing you of being a transphobe. And, a lot of people I know are accused of this on a routine basis. And I'm not saying transphobia doesn't exist. I know there are people out there who will feel a sense of hate or grievance towards people with gender dysphoria. I don't know anyone, and I've never met anyone who falls into that category. And yet most of the people I know appear to be accused of this on a daily basis. So what on earth is going on here?
Yeah, I've bent over backwards to not be any sort of provocateur or even be perceived as one. I'm just the guy telling people that sex is real and that it matters in certain contexts because we're sexually dimorphic. It really doesn't go much more beyond that. I'll criticize the gender ideology and point out flaws in it, but I've always been the person that attacks ideas and never people or groups. And I don't want to use I have trans friends argument, but I do, and they're they're some of my closest friends that I currently have, and I'm happy to use their preferred pronouns in certain as a social politeness for them, and it's not even hard to do. So for me to be flagged as this beyond the pale person when I'm just making scientific arguments about what sex is and why I think gender ideology is harmful, if I'm beyond the pale, then holy crap, there's so many, that's pretty extreme,
Some of the most gentle, kind-hearted people I know are being branded as fascists, and yeah. it is utterly insane. And it does come back to what you're doing with your Substack, with Reality's Last Stand, is that, these people are detached from reality. If they think that these liberal people who want everyone to be able to live their own life and live in happiness, if they think those people are fascists, then we're lost, aren't we?
Yeah, we're totally lost. Yeah.
So what do we do to bring people back into the real world? What do we do about that?
I think we're doing that currently. I started writing about this stuff in 2018, and I look at some of the comments on Twitter to those articles, and no one got it. Everyone's like, "Oh, this biologist, he doesn't understand the difference between sex and gender." It's like, no, I do, but they're blurring those lines. But now when I write an article and put it out, people get it. Everyone gets it, at least, a lot more people than before. We're seeing the New York Times now sort of starting published articles that are critical of the gender medicine for kids and things like that. This would have been unthinkable just a couple of years ago. So it's happening. It's slow, but it's snowballing. And I think it just needs to reach a point where more people feel comfortable to speak up against it. And the more people who are speaking up, you can't cancel everyone. And we're reaching that point, I think. I'm not going to predict when that inflection point will take place, but it's, I think it's in the next couple of years.
Well, I hope you're right about that. But one thing that I don't think is getting any better is the political tribalism and the determination of activists online to mischaracterize really decent people as essentially evil. That seems to me to be escalating. And might it be that it's escalating because their arguments aren't being won, because they sense that people are waking up to the problems? Might it be a signifier of desperation?
I think the desperation thing is really accurate. I think, like getting an animal cornered, they're lashing out in an extreme way because their ideas, the way that they can just, call someone a transphobe and make them disappear, that's not working as much as it used to. And so they need to turn up the heat and just call everyone everything they can even more frequently. So I think that's what we're seeing. I think it'll get more and more extreme up into the point where, they actually start losing power relative to the people that are speaking up against this stuff. I think so. It's going to get crazier before it gets better. Well, but the craziness isn't necessarily a sign that it's not going to get better.
Exactly. I mean, I've noticed just from my own experience, more and more people referring to me as far right and things on Twitter. These are people on Twitter who know nothing about me. But the ones who actually take the time to look into what I stand for, they realise that's the opposite of what I stand for, and it very quickly falls apart. Anyone who sort of has any acquaintance with me whatsoever, but that doesn't stop the sheer. I have to say, it's hysteria from what I've seen on Twitter, which is why I now no longer even attempt to engage. I don't think you can engage with hysterical people. Maybe it's about choosing our battles and addressing people who are still capable of rational discourse.
I agree with that completely. I don't use Twitter to argue with people to think that I'm going to convince them that they're wrong. But whenever you look at a tweet, you see, how many impressions that it made. Maybe it only has like 100 likes, but there's sometimes thousands of impressions. So people are seeing these things who are not necessarily commenting. And I think if you're just putting your rational approach based in scientific fact alongside the sort of gender ideologue, hate-filled, screeching that they tend to do, the people who are in the sidelines of watching these conversations, they can tell the difference between, which one seems to be having a reasonable conversation and who's open to arguments and which side isn't. So I think talking to those fence sitters or the people who are at least somewhat new to this, that's my target audience. I don't think for a second I'm going to convince anyone I'm directly engaging with that they're wrong or that they're going to admit it publicly on a public platform. But there's a lot of people who are paying attention to these arguments. And I think those are the ones that we need to sort of focus on changing their mind.
I mean, I suppose it relates to the cartoon that Elon Musk retweeted, your cartoon about the way in which you considered yourself on the left, the ground shifted, and you ended up being perceived as being on the right. I mean, that's pretty much the essence of what the cartoon was saying, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's really only on a set of core values too. Like, I'm sure you could make that cartoon if you would draw it for certain individual political questions. It could look very different, but it's really, I mean, when I drew it in my mind, it's on just the core values that I had that made me consider myself on the left, which was just like, standing up for free speech, which has been previously conceived as the way for, oppressed groups to speak truth to power. This is like a sacrosanct belief on the left. Racial issues that, I've always been of the sort of Martin Luther King, judge people by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin. And now we see this identity politics that is more interested in group interests than individual rights. And then on women's rights, this is something that I've always been for. And now we have this gender ideology that has made it impossible to even know what a woman is. And now men can be women. This is, it's completely insane. So it's not that my position has changed on the spectrum, but if I stand back and I look at where my values are best reflected now, it does tend to be on people who I would consider center right than center left now. But this isn't because I've changed, as my cartoon shows. It's because the left has like drawn out so far the left that the center has sort of passed me by, and this is now where I'm perceived to be now.
Because I've been told that being in favour of free speech makes you right-wing, and that it's a far-right talking point or a right-wing dog whistle, these kind of things. I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, there's been a dramatic change in the narrative of people using free speech in scare quotes and so-called free speech. This might just be a cyclical thing where whoever has most of the power has incentives to squash the speech of others because they're hoarding all the power. You can only lose it more if others are allowed to speak. So, I mean, this could probably will change hands as powers change in the future. But, as an individual, I'm going to just be for free speech no matter what side. I mean, I never considered myself having a side in this whole thing. I don't believe in the political tribalism. It's really unfortunate that this is something that has been completely abandoned on the left. But there are people who do embrace it.
I've noticed a lot of people going after Elon Musk as well and characterizing him as far right because of his ostensible support for free speech. And, you having been retweeted by him and having your cartoon put out there, I suppose you must have had some kind of flack from that.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of articles of people trying to debunk my cartoon with, high-powered analyses and things like that. It's a political cartoon. It's not a dissertation on anything. It's got a two-dimensional political axis, and there's probably tons of issues where the cartoon would look dramatically different. But it spoke to a lot of people. I mean, I think it's got over, or at least close to 300,000 retweets right now, and almost, if not more than 2 million likes. So it struck a nerve. It resonates with people, and I think rather than people trying to debunk the cartoon, they should ask themselves, why does this resonate with people so much? Why do so many people in the comments say this describes my experience exactly? It's best to reflect on that rather than dismiss it, because that reflection will, I guess, help them better understand what they've potentially done wrong and how we can decrease this polarization. I'm actually quite happy the conversations that cartoon started. I never thought it would be the most talked about thing for like a day and a half, but I'm glad it was.
I mean, it's important because, how else do people explain Bernie Sanders supporters who ended up voting for Donald Trump? I mean, this sort of thing actually does matter, that if you think of politics in this now outdated, I think, right-left binary, you're missing a lot. And particularly you're missing the incredible impact of the culture war on politics and on elections. It wins and loses elections. This is something that people, they'd rather just pretend that the culture war isn't a thing, that it's concocted, a confection of the right, and yet again and again we see its impact playing out when election time comes around.
Yeah, there's a really big problem in the U.S., especially because we have the whole duopoly going with the political parties. There's just only two main ones, and so no matter how nuanced your view is when it comes to election day, you largely just have to sort of take in all things considered and make a binary choice with your vote. So with me having been considered center left, I could just change my views very slightly, but that could change my binary choice on what side I vote for. Whereas someone who was, center left before, who went, maybe their ideological shift was huge and they went so much further to the left, their vote stays the same. But since I changed my vote, I'm considered like the radical who's abandoned my values on one side, even though like ideologically my shift was incremental compared to theirs. And this is used as just a way to hammer people over the head for the culture war and say that, you've gotten so extreme, Colin, because now you're voting for Republicans. It's fodder for the culture war.
I mean, that's an odd thing as well, isn't it? It feels like an act of projection, that kind of accusation. I mean, I often hear people say things like J.K. Rowling was radicalized online, but apparently to be radicalized online is to endorse a view that 99% of people hold and have always held. And surely it would be the 1% who are now claiming there's no such thing as men and women, and only doing so over the past 5 years. To me, that would probably be, I don't think anyone here has been radicalized online, but that would be the more likely, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And the only way they can say that people like J.K. Rowling have been radicalized is because they've created this like culture of fear of anyone who talks about this. So they look around, in your academic department, raise your hand if you don't think sex is a spectrum. Oh, no one's raising their hand? Okay. We seem to have a scientific consensus though that sex is a spectrum. People in that crowd, they might have seen someone like me say sex is a spectrum and just get hammered, and people going after me to get me either fired or to ruin my reputation so I can't get hired anywhere else. People notice that. So you have this chilling effect. So you create this false scientific consensus on these issues because you scare people who would disagree with you. That's happening not just on the sex and gender debate, but I see it across tons of other topics too. It's really quite insane.
I mean, you sound, when we were talking earlier about this issue, it sounded like you were quite optimistic that eventually this will win out over the next couple of years. But will it win out in academia? Because from what you're describing, if you're seen as the marginal one, and yet you're just presenting scientific fact, if that's a marginal thing within the scientific community, isn't it going to take a lot longer to rectify that problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the universities, there's several ways that they could go. I'm not very optimistic about the universities. Some people say they need to be reformed from within. I'm not so sure that there's the mechanisms for reform from within. Some people think they need to just crumble to the ground and then a newer, better university can rise from the ashes like a phoenix. And then the one I'm more interested in, surprised I'm an evolutionary biologist, is sort of the Darwinian approach, where you have other universities like the University of Austin, for instance. If they're wildly successful with their new model that's sort of like an anti-woke type thing, that'll send a message, and that could maybe even contribute to an internal shift if it's just we need to compete with these new universities that are doing so well based on these different sets of values. I think probably that's the way to go, is the parallel, or at least the competitive environment. The only main issue is you get a lot of these accrediting institutions who are putting in these DEI things in their in order to give for a school to get accreditation. They need to have sort of tip their hat to these woke ideas. So that could be a problem. So maybe we need alternative accrediting systems as well. It's a complete mess, but I think the competitive environment is probably the way to go on these.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because in the short term, at least, say you are a young person and you decide to go to one of these new universities that take this anti-woke stance, that are interested in the pursuit of truth and core traditional educational values. It's perfectly possible for people to render such degrees useless by stigmatizing them.
Exactly. If they'll see, University of Austin, they'll do to them what a lot of people do to the University of Phoenix now. It's in academia. I've been in those rooms where people are looking at applications. And for people who don't know, the University of Phoenix is a sort of this online for-profit university that, I'm sure they have some good classes, but they're seen by a lot of people as exploitative. And I've been in groups before where they're going through applications and it's just like University of Phoenix and it's just in the trash, basically. That'll happen, I'm sure, to people who go to the University of Austin. But at some point, if they're producing a lot of good scholars who businesses can trust, that are actually competent rather than just being pushed along through their programs, eventually that signal is going to be worth something. If it's an honest signal, it'll catch on, but it might not be immediate. So
I mean, that's it. They will be producing higher caliber minds. I mean, that's going to be the bottom line. But also, I imagine it's quite attractive for a genuinely intellectually curious young person to go to a university that will stretch them and challenge them, and not one that will simply demand conformity.
Oh, I agree. That's how I feel when I went to university. I mean, I graduated in 2012 from UC Davis, and it was an amazing environment. It wasn't soon after, though, that a lot of universities had a major sea change and it shifted. But if we could just go back to what universities were 10 years ago, that'd be a big improvement. But I think we can do even better than that, because a lot of these, departments of humanities based on queer theory, critical theory, all this stuff, they have no place in the university. These are ideological, activist mills. They're not scholarly in any real sense, and I don't. They should be funded, honestly.
Just before we finish, I want to ask you a bit about the political climate in America. Do you think that Joe Biden's administration has made all of these issues a lot harder, has actually raised the temperature of the culture war?
I don't know if it's raised. I would say that someone like Trump raises the temperature more, but then people like Biden, they're not an obstruction to any of sort of the woke, critical theory, queer theory ideologies. I don't think Biden is particularly woke himself, but he's certainly not going to be standing in the way for any of these ideologies to come through. I think he's expected to try to push through the Equality Act, which includes gender identity along sex as a protected category. And so basically this would mean that in federally funded institutions, you can't discriminate on the basis of gender identity. So, say by the women's sports in any college that's receiving federal funding. There's also maybe some changes that are going to be happening to Title IX. Again, right now the wording is talking about biological sex, but of course, gender identity is always what's coming up to be injected into those laws that would dramatically reinterpret top down how these things are enforced in society. No, I don't think he's particularly turning up the heat, but he's definitely making the problem worse for woke ideology, I suppose.
I mean, from our perspective, from a British perspective, we looked on at the American election and we thought that Biden was the non-woke candidate amongst the Democrats, and that's one of the reasons why he was successful in securing the nomination. And yet one of the first things he did when he's in office is to sign it was relating to women's sports, wasn't it? He was talking about trans inclusion in women's sports. That happened a couple of weeks after he was elected. So if we do get this situation where it's signed into law that gender identity has to be observed, even when it comes to sports categories, I mean, that's going to be very difficult to unravel, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be really, really difficult. I mean, they're already succeeding largely just by redefining words. So if you have women's sports, they've redefined a woman as anyone who identifies as one, rather than what the whole point for segregating sports in the first place is due to biological sex, and everyone knows that. But if you can just change the definition or just apply it differently, then you can have reinforce these laws in any ways that you like. But it is a much more bigger problem if you're actually changing the text and putting gender identity right in there as protected as just as much as sex is. I don't know why a subjective brain state like that needs to be a protected category, especially one that can be fluid and change moment to moment over time, or can encompass multiple identities at the same time. It's just a pseudoscientific ideology.
Surely it can only work if you accept the premise that gender self-ID can never be fraudulent. In other words, anyone who says there's something must be treated as something. But of course, there are all sorts of ways in which that could be exploited, right?
Oh, I mean, of course, people are going to exploit it. There's already been examples of people exploiting the ideology. It's like a sociopath's playground. Anyone who wants to manipulate people, they can just enter themselves into any environment they want to, at the expense of women largely, since they have more to fear from people self-IDing as women than men have to fear from women self-IDing as men.
Do you think, though, that the Leah Thomas case it has? I mean, I think it's had a massive effect, because I think just that visual image of Leah Thomas standing on the podium, being obviously male, towering over the other competitors. I mean, I think that's woken an awful lot of people up. And sometimes it's those moments that when it's no longer an abstract idea, it's something very, very material and very obviously so. Do you think that's right?
Absolutely. I think I'm kind of leaning more and more towards this, like, let's just get as crazy as we can as fast as possible to get it over with. And I think that people like Leah Thomas, in one race, I think she beat the next second place swimmer by something like 37 seconds, which is just, I'd count it out here, but it'd be a lot of dead air time if we did that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's truly shocking. It's like this perfect example of, like, if your ideology is so detached from reality, well, that has a consequence. You're going to see these consequences pop up, and these absurdities pop up. It's just like if you're building bridges, if you're an engineer and you don't know anything about engineering, like, you're going to see your bridges collapsing the moment a truck tries to drive over it. Unfortunately, like, ideologies, they're not as, you don't get as much immediate feedback from the environment when you're detached from reality, but you still will get these. The biological equivalent of a collapsing bridge, I think, is like Leah Thomas competing against in women's sports and winning by 37 seconds and winning the NCAA Division I Women's Championship recently in Atlanta. So it piques a lot of people. I think it ultimately helps us, even though it's unfortunate for the athletes who are placing second or third, or
One of the great things about the way that you write as well is that you do write in an accessible way. Most people haven't got a clue about evolutionary biology or even biology, but people do find this very, very confusing. But you do lay the points out in a very accessible, very clear way, and it feels it's irrefutable because you're dealing in scientific fact. And now you've sort of started the Substack. Do you want to tell us about what you're doing with the Substack?
Yeah, so I have a Substack. It's called Reality's Last Stand, and it's broadly associated with providing good, accurate information, articles, newsletters, reading lists about sex differences, the biology of sex, criticizing gender ideology, why it conflicts with biology, why it's pseudoscience, sort of arming people with the proper arguments they need to push back against a lot of the gender ideology that's happening in society. I want it to be just sort of this main platform where it's not even just me, but other authors that are contribute, sort of like an online magazine publication on this stuff. It's my newest endeavor. I started about 2 years ago, but I've recently left my day job to do this full time, and it's been exhilarating to do, and I'm enjoying every second of it. That's also why the whole PayPal fiasco is a little scarier, because Substack is powered by Stripe, which is this other payment service, and they've been upholding free speech so far, but I'm still a click away from some angry intern just shutting everything off. But I don't think we'll have to worry about that for a while. But it's a great platform.
No, I don't think so. I mean, Substack does appear to have a very strong commitment to free speech, and long may that continue. Well, Colin, thanks so much for talking to me today, and really good luck with your Substack and everything else that you're doing.
Thanks so much. I appreciate what you're doing as well. It's fantastic.
Thanks very much. This has been the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle, and my guest, Colin Wright. You can follow Colin on Twitter at SwipeRight, and you can check out his Substack, Reality's Last Stand, as well. And if you enjoyed the podcast, make sure that you like and subscribe, tell your friends about it, and come and join me next week where we'll have another fabulous guest. See you then.